August 7, 1943. The main headquarters of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry, Berlin, Colonel Josef Schmid, head of the Luftwaffe Intelligence's 5th Abteilung, stood before a mahogany desk cluttered with aerial reconnaissance photographs, agent reports, and prisoner interrogation summaries. In his hands he held a single document that would fundamentally alter every assumption the German High Command held about the air war. It was a captured American production manifest, stamped and authenticated, listing monthly aircraft deliveries to units in England during July 1943. The numbers made no sense. According to this document, American factories had delivered more than 7,000 aircraft to the European theatre in a single month. 7,000. Schmid had spent the previous 72 hours cross-referencing this figure with every available intelligence source, desperately searching for the error that would make these numbers less apocalyptic. He found none. Instead, every additional source confirmed the same impossible truth. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. America was not just outproducing Germany in aircraft, they were operating on a scale that defied comprehension, on a level that made German industrial capacity look like cottage workshop production. The document Schmid held represented something more devastating than any tactical defeat or strategic setback. It was mathematical proof that Germany had already lost the air war before the decisive battles had even been fought. The sky belonged to the Allies not through superior pilot skill or aircraft design, though both mattered, but because American factories could build planes faster than German pilots could shoot them down, faster than German factories could replace losses, faster than German strategic planning could even comprehend. The journey to this moment of terrible clarity had begun months earlier, but its roots stretched back years into fundamental miscalculations about American industrial potential. In May 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before the United States Congress and announced that America would produce 50,000 aircraft annually as part of a massive rearmament program. The proclamation reached Berlin through multiple intelligence channels within days. When German leadership reviewed this claim, their response was dismissive, even contemptuous. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and one of Adolf Hitler's closest advisors, reportedly laughed when informed of Roosevelt's announcement. The Americans, he assured his staff, could only make refrigerators and razor blades. They could never produce the military equipment necessary to challenge German air superiority. This assessment seemed entirely reasonable, based on observable facts. In 1939, American military aircraft production totaled fewer than 3,000 planes annually. The number was documented, verified, undeniable. Germany was producing more. How could a nation with such limited aviation capacity suddenly increase production 17-fold in just 2 years? It violated every principle of industrial mobilization that German experience had established. Building aircraft factories required years of construction. Training skilled workers demanded months of instruction. Developing production techniques necessitated extensive trial and error. Roosevelt's proclamation seemed like the fantasy of a desperate politician rather than achievable reality. The German intelligence services, particularly the 5th Abteilung under Schmid's direction, had the institutional responsibility for tracking Allied air capabilities. They collected information from multiple sources. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights photographed British and American airfields, counting aircraft on the ground. Signals intelligence intercepted radio communications, tracking unit designations and movements. Agent networks operating in neutral. Countries reported on factory expansion and production activity. Systematic interrogation of captured Allied aircrew provided first-hand accounts of equipment and organization. Throughout 1941 and 1942, as America entered the war and began mobilizing, the intelligence picture reaching Berlin remained incomplete and confusing. Some reports indicated massive increases in output, factories running multiple shifts, tens of thousands of aircraft rolling off assembly lines. Other reports suggested continued economic struggles, labor disputes, inefficient production methods, equipment of inferior quality. The German High Command chose to believe the more comforting assessments, the ones that aligned with their preconceptions about American weakness. This selective acceptance of intelligence was not unique to Germany. All military organizations tend to favor information confirming existing beliefs over data challenging core assumptions. But in Germany's case, the cost of this cognitive bias would prove catastrophic. After all, Germany was winning in 1941 and early 1942. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, France in 6 weeks, Yugoslavia in 11 days. The Luftwaffe had proven itself formidable in every theatre. Why should German leadership fear a nation that had not fought a major air war since 1918, whose air force was tiny, whose aircraft were considered obsolete? The foundation of German confidence rested on observable superiority. German aircraft, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter and the Junkers Ju 88 bomber, were proven combat designs. German pilots were experienced veterans with hundreds of combat hours. German tactics, developed through years of warfare in Spain, Poland, France, and Russia, represented the cutting edge of aerial combat doctrine. American aircraft that German intelligence had examined captured examples from British units or technical specifications obtained through neutral countries seemed unimpressive. The P-40 Warhawk fighter was considered adequate, but not exceptional. American bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress were large and well-armed but lacked the speed and maneuverability German fighters could exploit. The comfortable certainty began developing cracks in North Africa. When American air units first engaged German forces in late 1942 and early 1943, the results seemed to confirm German expectations. American pilots were inexperienced, their formations were poorly coordinated, their tactics were elementary. German fighters shot down American aircraft at favorable ratios. But something about the American air presence troubled experienced Luftwaffe commanders. The sheer quantity of their aircraft was staggering. American units that suffered heavy losses in combat were fully re-equipped within days. Aircraft, spare parts, fuel, ammunition flowed in seemingly endless streams. American air bases that Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed contained more aircraft than entire German air fleets possessed. The logistics supporting these operations exceeded anything German forces had achieved even at the peak of their power. Field commanders began sending increasingly alarmed reports to Berlin. Each American fighter group, they noted, possessed more spare parts than an entire German Geschwader. American logistics units operated ground equipment fleets larger than those available to entire German Air Corps. Supply installations captured during German advances contained fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and equipment in quantities that seemed wasteful by German standards. These reports were noted, filed, and largely dismissed by intelligence analysts and high command leadership. Field commanders always exaggerated enemy strength. Pilots naturally overestimated the numbers of enemy aircraft they encountered. The complaints were dismissed as the predictable tendency of operational units to emphasize difficulties over opportunities. Yet the volume of concerning data increased exponentially throughout 1943. After Allied victories in North Africa, Tunisia specifically in May, German intelligence conducted systematic interrogation of captured Luftwaffe personnel. The debriefing teams sought to understand not just tactical details, but broader patterns of Allied, particularly American, air capability. The stories these prisoners told were remarkably consistent across rank, unit, and experience level. Every interrogated pilot described American aircraft abundance that seemed impossible. They spoke of seeing dozens of replacement aircraft arriving at forward bases daily. They described American units operating with fuel allocations that exceeded German consumption by factors of 3 or 4 to 1. They recounted aerial reconnaissance missions that revealed aircraft storage facilities larger than anything in the German Air Force, containing fighters, bombers, and transports in quantities that appeared unlimited. Medical facilities at captured American air bases were equipped with supplies and equipment superior to most German aviation hospitals. Captured American aircrew received better food as prisoners of war than Luftwaffe pilots ate on operations. Some accounts seemed so extreme that interrogators initially suspected exaggeration or Allied psychological warfare, but the consistency across hundreds of independent interrogations made dismissal impossible. Fighter pilots and bomber crews, officers and enlisted men, experienced veterans and replacement personnel, all told the same stories of overwhelming American material superiority. More significantly, these accounts matched what German forces were experiencing in other theatres. In Sicily, captured in July and August 1943, Luftwaffe units encountered similar patterns. Allied air superiority was not achieved through superior tactics or better aircraft, though American fighters were steadily improving. It was achieved through simply overwhelming numbers. German fighters could shoot down 5 or 10 Allied aircraft in a successful engagement, only to face 50 more the next day. The mathematics of attrition made German tactical victories strategically meaningless, but prisoner accounts, while concerning, could theoretically be dismissed as subjective impressions, exaggerated by defeated soldiers trying to explain their failure. The captured documents, however, could not be dismissed. Unlike aircrew testimony, production manifests were clinical, bureaucratic, or undeniable. They were not meant to impress or intimidate. They were simply the routine paperwork of American military logistics, the mundane forms that tracked aircraft and supplies through the distribution system, and the numbers they contained were apocalyptic for German strategic planning. One particular document proved especially illuminating. It was the production manifest Colonel Schmid held on that August morning, a monthly delivery report for American air units in England during July 1943. The report, stamped and signed by multiple logistics officers, listed aircraft delivered by type and destination. The document appeared authentic. Multiple independent sources, including captured American personnel who worked in logistics, confirmed such reports were standard procedure. The format matched other captured American military paperwork. The serial numbers could be cross-referenced with aircraft shot down or captured, and they matched. The numbers staggered belief. According to this single document, American factories had delivered 7,156 aircraft to units in the European theatre during July 1943 alone. This figure included 2,431 fighters, 1,897 heavy bombers, 612 medium bombers, and 2,216 transport and miscellaneous aircraft. These were not worldwide production figures. These were deliveries to one theatre, in 1 month, for routine operations. Colonel Schmid compared these numbers to German aircraft production. The entire German aviation industry, operating at maximum capacity with factories running multiple shifts, drawing on resources from occupied territories, exploiting slave labour, had produced approximately 2,600 aircraft of all types in July 1943. The Americans were delivering nearly 3 times that number to a single theatre, while simultaneously supplying forces in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, supporting Soviet operations through Lend-Lease, maintaining training programs in the United States, and building up reserves. The implications were staggering. If these figures were accurate, and every verification attempt suggested they were, then American aircraft production exceeded German output by factors that made strategic parity impossible. This was not a marginal advantage that could be overcome through superior tactics or better pilot training. This was industrial capacity so overwhelming that tactical considerations became essentially irrelevant. Schmid requested additional intelligence on American aircraft production from all available sources. What came back over the following weeks was compiled from multiple independent channels. Agent reports from Switzerland and Sweden, where German intelligence maintained networks, provided information on American factory expansion. Neutral country trade statistics could be analyzed for patterns indicating industrial activity. Technical manuals captured with American aircraft listed manufacturer details and serial numbers. Analysis of equipment serial numbers from shot down or captured aircraft allowed production volume estimates. Open-source intelligence from American newspapers and magazines published information about factory achievements and production records. Each source had limitations and potential for error. Agents could be deceived. Statistics could be misinterpreted. Serial numbers might not represent continuous production. American media could publish propaganda rather than fact. But when multiple independent sources confirmed the same basic picture, the conclusions became undeniable. The production statistics that gradually emerged painted a portrait of industrial capacity beyond German comprehension. In 1939, the United States produced approximately 5,856 aircraft total, military and civilian combined. German intelligence had documented this figure and considered it confirmation of American weakness. America was clearly behind in military preparation, just as Nazi ideology predicted. But by 1942, the first full year of American participation in the war, production had exploded to 47,836 aircraft. This represented a more than 8-fold increase in 3 years. German intelligence officers initially suspected these figures were propaganda or included every type of airframe, regardless of military value. Training aircraft, gliders, civilian designs impressed into military service all counted to inflate the numbers. But analysis of captured equipment, prisoner interrogations, and agent reports confirmed the figures represented combat aircraft comparable to German types. Fighters, bombers, transports, reconnaissance aircraft, all categories showed similar massive increases. In 1943, the year when Schmid stood in his Berlin office contemplating the impossible, American production reached 85,898 aircraft. Germany, by comparison, produced approximately 25,000 aircraft in the same year. This figure represented significant increases over previous years and required enormous industrial effort. Factory expansion, extended shifts, streamlined production methods, exploitation of concentration camp labor. German industry was operating at maximum sustainable capacity. Production of 25,000 aircraft in a year was considered an impressive achievement, proof of German industrial strength and organizational capability. Yet the Americans were producing more than 3 aircraft for every 1 Germany built, and the gap was widening rather than narrowing. More disturbing still, American production was accelerating while German production struggled under the weight of Allied bombing campaigns, raw material shortages, and competing demands from other weapons programs. The Allied bombing of German industry, which had been dismissed as pinprick attacks in earlier years, was beginning to affect production capacity by mid-1943. The specific aircraft types being produced revealed further disturbing patterns. The Americans were building heavy 4-engine bombers in massive quantities. The B-17 Flying Fortress, which German intelligence had initially dismissed as too large and unwieldy for combat effectiveness, was being produced at a rate of more than 1,000 per month by mid-1943. Total production of B-17 aircraft would eventually reach 12,692 units. The B-24 Liberator, another 4-engine heavy bomber, was being built in even larger numbers. Total wartime production would exceed 18,000 units. German heavy bomber programs, by contrast, had essentially failed. The Heinkel He 177, Germany's attempt at a 4-engine strategic bomber, never entered large-scale production due to persistent technical problems and the death of its advocate, General Walther Wever, in 1936. Germany was fighting a war where air power would prove decisive, yet German bomber production consisted primarily of medium twin-engine designs like the Heinkel He 111 and the Junkers Ju 88. These were capable aircraft, proven in combat, but they lacked the range and payload capacity to strike deep into enemy territory or to deliver the bomb tonnage necessary for strategic effect. Fighter production comparisons proved equally lopsided. The Americans were building multiple fighter types in quantities that exceeded Germany's total production across all models. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a large single-engine fighter that German intelligence had initially dismissed as too heavy and unwieldy, was being produced at rates exceeding 1,000 per month by late 1943. Total production would reach 15,683 units. The North American P-51 Mustang, which would become perhaps the most significant Allied fighter of the war, was entering production in increasing numbers. Total wartime production would exceed 15,000 units. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, considered by German intelligence to be an adequate but unexceptional design, was produced in numbers exceeding 13,000. Even aircraft types that saw limited combat service were produced in quantities that would have represented Germany's entire fighter production. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Bell P-39 Era Cobra, which saw limited use with American forces but was supplied in large numbers to the Soviet Union, was produced in quantities exceeding 9,500 units. German fighter production, concentrated primarily on the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, reached approximately 15,000 units in 1943. This represented maximum effort, the absolute peak of what German industry could achieve. The Americans were building more fighters in multiple individual types than Germany's entire national production across all categories. But perhaps the most revealing comparison involved not combat aircraft, but transports and support types. Modern air warfare requires logistics. Aircraft must be delivered from factories to operational units. Replacement aircraft must be moved to forward bases. Damaged aircraft must be transported to repair facilities. Supplies, personnel, and equipment must be moved by air to maintain operations. The Americans were building transport aircraft in quantities that exceeded German combat aircraft production. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the civilian DC-3 airliner, was being produced at extraordinary rates. This twin-engine transport could carry troops, cargo, or serve as an air ambulance. It was not a glamorous aircraft. It would never appear on propaganda posters or feature in newsreels celebrating aerial victories, but it represented something far more important than individual heroic aircraft. It represented systematic industrial capacity applied to every aspect of air warfare. Total production of the C-47 would exceed 10,000 units. Germany, by comparison, relied primarily on the Junkers Ju-52 transport, a tri-motor design that had first flown in 1930. The Ju-52 was reliable and proven, but slow and vulnerable. German production of all transport aircraft types totaled fewer than 2,000 units during the entire war. The Americans were building more transport aircraft than Germany built combat aircraft in many production years. The captured documents revealed something even more disturbing than simple production numbers. They demonstrated American production efficiency that German industry could not match. One technical manual captured with a B-24 bomber proved particularly illuminating for German analysts trying to understand how American production achieved such scale. The manual, intended for assembly line workers and quality control inspectors, described production processes at the Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan. The facility employed tens of thousands of workers, producing B-24, Liberator heavy bombers on assembly lines based directly on automotive manufacturing principles. Peak monthly production at this single facility reached one aircraft per 63 minutes in April 1944. While this exceptional rate was not sustained throughout the war, sustained monthly production exceeded 400 aircraft. By comparison, German bomber production from all facilities combined averaged fewer than 1,000 aircraft per month across all types. One American factory was producing more heavy bombers than Germany's entire aviation industry produced bombers of all types. And this was just one of multiple American bomber production facilities. The manual revealed production methods that German industry had never implemented at such scale. Bombers moved down assembly lines just like automobiles. Sub-assemblies were produced in parallel, wings in one area, fuselages in another, engines and systems in separate sections, then brought together for final assembly. Workers specialized in specific tasks rather than having craftsmen build entire components. Specialized jigs and fixtures ensured components fit together properly without requiring skilled fitting. Interchangeable parts meant that components could be mass-produced and assembled without individual customization. Quality control used statistical sampling rather than individual inspection. The entire process was optimized for volume production at the expense of flexibility, customization, or traditional craftsmanship. German aircraft production, by contrast, retained many characteristics of artisanal manufacturing. Skilled workers fitted components together, making adjustments to ensure proper fit. Tolerances were tighter, finish quality higher, individual craftsmanship more evident. German aircraft were in many ways superior products: better engineering, more sophisticated systems, higher performance in many categories. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW1 and 190 were excellent fighters that Allied pilots respected and feared. But Germany produced one aircraft for every 3 or 4 Americans built. The mathematical reality made quality differences strategically irrelevant. A German fighter might shoot down 2 or 3 Allied aircraft in successful combat, but if the Allies could send 10 aircraft and lose half without affecting operational capability, the superior German aircraft became meaningless. Quality became irrelevant against overwhelming quantity. The intelligence analysis revealed that America had multiple aircraft production programs running simultaneously at different facilities operated by companies with different specializations. The B-17 Flying Fortress was produced by Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega at multiple facilities. The P-51 Mustang was produced by North American Aviation at plants in California and Texas. The C-47 Transport was built by Douglas at facilities in California, Oklahoma, and Illinois. These companies had varying levels of previous aircraft manufacturing experience, but all applied existing industrial expertise to aviation production. Automotive manufacturers like Ford brought mass production techniques. Agricultural equipment makers brought heavy machinery fabrication expertise. The distributed production model provided resilience that German centralized production could not match. If one facility was bombed or experienced problems, others continued production. Total American output barely fluctuated even when individual facilities faced difficulties. Germany, with more centralized production, was far more vulnerable to disruption. A successful bombing raid on a critical facility could significantly impact national production. The attack on the Messerschmitt Regensburg factory on August 17, 1943, for example, temporarily reduced fighter production by a measurable percentage. American distributed production was not just more productive, but also more resilient, harder to disrupt, and capable of rapid expansion by bringing additional facilities online. The aluminum production comparison underlined the aircraft production disparity. Aircraft require aluminum. Lightweight, strong, resistant to corrosion, aluminum became the primary structural material for modern aircraft. Military aircraft production in an industrial war is fundamentally constrained by aluminum availability. Germany produced approximately 250,000 tons of aluminum in 1943, representing near maximum output from German smelting capacity, plus production from occupied territories. This figure included output from facilities in occupied France, Norway, and other territories operating under German direction. The United States produced approximately 920,000 tons of aluminum in 1943. America produced nearly 4 tons of aluminum for every 1 ton Germany produced. This disparity translated directly to aircraft production capacity. More aluminum meant more aircraft. The aluminum production gap was not something that could be overcome through better designs, superior engineering, or tactical excellence. It was a fundamental resource constraint that determined maximum possible aircraft production. Aviation fuel production told a similar story of overwhelming American advantage. High-octane aviation gasoline requires sophisticated refining processes and specific petroleum sources. German aviation fuel production was constrained by limited domestic petroleum and dependence on synthetic fuel production from coal. The synthetic fuel program represented massive industrial effort, consuming enormous electrical power and resources to produce gasoline from coal. Romanian oil imports supplemented domestic production, but required maintaining control of the Balkans and protecting vulnerable supply lines. German aviation fuel production in 1943 reached approximately 750,000 tons. This represented absolute maximum output, achieved through total exploitation of every available source. Luftwaffe operations were perpetually constrained by fuel availability. Strategic decisions about when and where to conduct operations often depended more on fuel stocks than tactical opportunities or enemy activity. American forces, by contrast, operated without any fuel constraints whatsoever. The United States petroleum industry produced aviation gasoline in quantities that exceeded German production by factors of 10 to 1 or greater. American air units received fuel allocations that exceeded their maximum possible consumption rates. Aircraft sometimes flew training missions or non-essential transport simply because fuel was abundant. The waste of fuel for purposes German forces would consider criminally negligent was routine in American operations. Pilot training comparisons revealed additional disparities in industrial capacity translated to operational capability. Modern air warfare requires trained pilots. Complex aircraft demand extensive instruction. Combat effectiveness depends on experience and skill developed through hundreds of flight hours. Germany had begun the war with a cadre of experienced pilots trained through years of systematic instruction and combat experience in Spain. These pilots were among the best in the world, true aviation elite. But by 1943, the original cadre was being steadily eroded through combat losses and attrition. German pilot training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and limited training aircraft availability, produced replacement pilots with fewer flight hours and less comprehensive instruction than earlier graduates. New Luftwaffe pilots entering combat in 1943 averaged approximately 150 to 200 hours of total flight time before their first combat mission. This represented reduced training compared to early war standards, but was considered adequate given resource constraints. American pilot training programs, by contrast, were producing pilots with 300 to 400 hours of flight time before assignment to combat units. American training bases operated with fuel abundance, aircraft availability, and instructor numbers that German programs could not approach. American pilots arrived at operational units with far more experience than their German counterparts, and the experience gap widened as the war continued, and German training programs were forced to reduce instruction hours due to fuel shortages and training aircraft losses. The mathematics of pilot attrition became increasingly unfavorable for Germany. When an experienced Luftwaffe pilot with hundreds or thousands of combat hours was killed or captured, he was replaced by a pilot with minimal training and no combat experience. The replacement pilot was more likely to be shot down quickly, creating a death spiral where German pilot quality declined, even as Allied pilot quality improved through better training and accumulated combat experience. Colonel Schmid compiled his analysis into a comprehensive report in September 1943. The report was clinical, mathematical, undeniable in its logic. It compared German aircraft production capacity to American output across every significant category: fighters, bombers, transports, reconnaissance aircraft. Every comparison told the same story. America was outproducing Germany by factors of 3 to 1 or greater, and the gap was widening rather than narrowing as the war continued. But the report went beyond simply presenting production numbers. Schmid included detailed projections of what these production figures meant for air operations over the next 12 to 24 months. He calculated that American production advantages meant Germany would face increasing numerical superiority in every theater. The Luftwaffe could continue winning individual engagements through superior tactics, experienced pilots, and sometimes better aircraft. But they would inevitably lose campaigns through attrition. Every aircraft destroyed, every pilot killed, every facility damaged would be replaced for the Americans within weeks or months. German losses took much longer to replace, if they were replaced at all. The mathematics of attrition warfare inexorably favored the side with industrial capacity to sustain losses indefinitely, and that side was not Germany. The report included projections for 1944 and beyond. If current production trends continued, by mid-1944, American air forces would achieve numerical superiority ratios of 5 to 1 or greater in most theaters. By 1945, ratios would likely reach 10 to 1 or higher in many operations. The Luftwaffe, no matter how well trained or tactically proficient, could not sustain combat against such numerical odds indefinitely. Quality advantages in individual aircraft became irrelevant when facing 10 times as many enemy aircraft. Even if German fighters maintained their tactical superiority, even if they won every engagement, the cumulative losses would eventually destroy the Luftwaffe through simple attrition. Available trained pilots were finite. Aluminum production was constrained, aviation fuel was limited. Territory was being lost rather than gained, reducing access to resources. The trajectory pointed inexorably toward defeat in the air war. The report concluded with mathematical certainty that Germany could not achieve air superiority against American production capacity given current industrial balance. This was not defeatism or political opinion. It was objective analysis based on verified data. The conclusion was professional assessment that should have informed strategic decision-making. Schmid expected the High Command to use this information to develop realistic strategic options. Perhaps Germany could concentrate, remaining air forces in critical theatres rather than dispersing them. Perhaps aircraft production could be rationalized, focusing on fewer types produced in larger numbers. Perhaps pilot training could be modified to maximize combat effectiveness of limited resources. Perhaps resources could be reallocated from offensive operations to defensive missions that might extend the war while seeking political settlement. At minimum, realistic understanding of the situation might prevent wasteful offensive operations that consumed irreplaceable aircraft and pilots without achieving strategic objectives. Schmid presented this report to his superiors in the Luftwaffe High Command with full knowledge of its controversial implications. He was not a defeatist. His professional record demonstrated commitment to German victory. He was not undermining morale. He was a professional intelligence officer presenting accurate analysis so that leadership could make informed decisions based on reality rather than wishful thinking. He expected disagreement, perhaps anger at the unwelcome conclusions. What he encountered was something worse: complete rejection of the analysis itself. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring refused to accept the report's conclusions. He called them defeatist propaganda, claims designed to undermine German fighting spirit. He argued that German willpower, superior tactics, and impending technological advances would overcome numerical disadvantages. Göring cited historical examples: Frederick the Great's victories when outnumbered, Hannibal's victories over Rome. He insisted that American production figures were exaggerated for propaganda purposes, that American aircraft were inferior and would fail in sustained combat, that American pilots lacked the skill and fighting spirit of German aviators. Quality would triumph over quantity, as it always had throughout German military history. Other Luftwaffe commanders reacted similarly. They pointed to continuing German tactical victories, to superior German aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 4-190 and the forthcoming Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, to defensive advantages of fighting over German territory where damaged aircraft could land safely and pilots could be recovered. They argued that German pilots were better trained, more experienced, more ideologically motivated than Allied forces. They believed that tactical excellence could overcome numerical disadvantage. Schmid attempted to explain that tactics became irrelevant against overwhelming material superiority, that quality differences disappeared when facing 5 or 10 times as many enemies, that even the best pilots could not fight effectively when outnumbered by such margins. His arguments were dismissed as defeatism. The report was filed and ignored. Intelligence analysis that should have informed strategic decision-making was rejected because its conclusions were politically and psychologically unacceptable. The Luftwaffe High Command's rejection of these intelligence assessments represented a fundamental failure to understand how modern industrial warfare worked. Military traditions from previous centuries emphasized courage, skill, leadership, tactical brilliance as decisive factors in warfare. These qualities had won wars for millennia. Individual warriors with superior training could defeat larger numbers of inferior opponents. Superior tactics could overcome numerical disadvantages. Brilliant commanders could achieve victory through maneuver and deception. But World War II was different from all previous conflicts. It was the first truly industrial total war, where victory depended more on factory output than battlefield prowess. The nation that could produce more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition, more supplies would win through simple attrition, regardless of tactical considerations. Germany's military leadership, trained in traditional Prussian military methods that emphasized operational art and tactical excellence, could not psychologically accept this new reality. Some German officers did understand. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's greatest fighter pilots and leader of Luftwaffe fighter forces from November 1941, wrote in his memoirs about studying intelligence reports on American production. He concluded that Germany was fighting an enemy with unlimited industrial resources and that achieving air superiority was impossible under these circumstances. He advocated for defensive strategies that might preserve the Luftwaffe as a viable force, rather than offensive operations that consumed resources without achieving strategic effect. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who fought against American air power in North Africa, Italy and France, noted in reports and letters that German tactical superiority meant nothing against enemies who could replace losses immediately, while German units fought with steadily dwindling resources. He understood that the air war was being lost, not through any failure of German pilots or tactics, but through simple industrial mathematics. Albert Speer, appointed Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production in February 1942, understood the production gap and worked frantically to increase German aircraft output. He achieved significant increases through rationalization of production, better resource allocation, concentration on fewer aircraft types, and ruthless exploitation of slave labor. German aircraft production increased substantially under his direction. 1944 saw peak German output at approximately 36,000 aircraft, nearly 50% more than 1943 production. But Speer knew his efforts were insufficient. American production in 1944 reached 96,318 aircraft. For every German aircraft produced, Americans built more than 2.5. The gap that Schmid had documented in his 1943 report had narrowed slightly in absolute terms but remained overwhelming. Germany could not win an industrial war of attrition against such production capacity. The intelligence services continued their work throughout 1944, even as their reports were systematically dismissed. They documented Allied air operations with the same precision they had applied to production statistics. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, involved air operations on a scale that exceeded anything Germany had achieved. More than 11,000 Allied aircraft supported the invasion on the first day. Fighter cover, ground attack missions, transport operations, reconnaissance flights, all conducted simultaneously in coordinated operations that demonstrated air power projection Germany could no longer match. Within weeks of the landing, Allied air forces were flying thousands of sorties daily, dropping thousands of tons of bombs, losing hundreds of aircraft to flak and fighters, and replacing those losses immediately. The 8th Air Force operating from England had more aircraft than the entire Luftwaffe. A single American bomber group, roughly equivalent to a German bomber group, had more aircraft and better serviceability rates than some Luftwaffe Flieger division. German aircraft production, despite Speer's efforts, peaked in autumn 1944 before declining sharply under the combined effects of Allied bombing, fuel shortages, and raw material constraints. The bombing of synthetic fuel production facilities, which began in earnest in May 1944, proved particularly devastating. German aviation fuel production, already barely sufficient for operational needs, declined by more than 70% between May and September 1944. Aircraft sitting on the ground for lack of fuel provided no combat value. Newly produced fighters could not be delivered to operational units because transport aircraft lacked fuel. Pilot training programs were reduced or suspended because training flights consumed fuel needed for combat operations. The Luftwaffe was dying not through lack of aircraft but through lack of fuel to fly them. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was operating with a fraction of its former capability, not because aircraft were unavailable, but because fuel to fly them did not exist. The sky belonged to the Allies through industrial dominance so complete that German tactical skill became strategically meaningless. The final devastating intelligence came in early 1945 through analysis of Allied strategic bombing operations. German intelligence documented that American and British air forces were now flying missions with bomber streams numbering 1,000 aircraft or more, escorted by hundreds of fighters, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German cities and industrial targets. These operations occurred almost daily, weather permitting, with loss rates the Allies could sustain indefinitely, while German losses in defending against these raids could not be replaced. One analysis proved particularly sobering. In a single month, February 1945, Allied air forces dropped more than 116,000 tons of bombs on German targets. This exceeded the total tonnage the Luftwaffe had dropped on all targets throughout the entire war. The roles had completely reversed. Germany, which had terrorized European cities with aerial bombardment in the war's early years, was now helpless against bombing campaigns of unprecedented scale and intensity. The intelligence reports documented not just American bomber operations, but the fighter escorts that made them possible. The North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks for extended range, could escort bombers deep into Germany and engage Luftwaffe fighters on equal or superior terms. American fighter production meant that losses in combat were immediately replaced. German fighter pilots, even when they achieved tactical victories by shooting down multiple bombers, found themselves facing fresh American fighter groups the next day, while their own units operated with declining strength. The mathematical proof of German defeat in the air war existed in every intelligence report compiled during 1944 and 1945. It existed in production statistics, showing American factories building aircraft in numbers Germany could never match. It existed in fuel consumption data, showing American operations without constraint, while German operations starved for fuel. It existed in pilot training figures, showing American pilots arriving at combat units with twice the flight hours of German replacements. It existed in loss replacement rates, showing American units maintaining full strength, while German units declined through attrition. The proof was comprehensive, verified from multiple sources, mathematically undeniable, and systematically ignored by leadership with power to act on it. Colonel Schmid continued his intelligence work until the final weeks of the war, documenting Allied air superiority with professional precision even as the Third Reich collapsed around him. His reports from early 1945 noted that the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as an operational force. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Pilot losses exceeded replacement rates. Allied fighters flew over German territory virtually unopposed. The few remaining operational Luftwaffe units, including jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me 262 that represented technological superiority, could not affect the war's outcome. They were too few, too late, operating without adequate fuel or pilot training. Quality had become completely irrelevant against overwhelming quantity. A handful of advanced German jets could not change the strategic situation when facing thousands of Allied conventional fighters. Looking back from the perspective of 8 decades, the German intelligence assessments of 1943 and 1944 appear both prescient and tragically futile. The analysts were correct in every major conclusion. Victory in the air war was impossible given the industrial balance. The mathematics of attrition made defeat inevitable. No amount of tactical skill could overcome such fundamental material disadvantage. Superior aircraft designs could not compensate for production ratios of 3:1 or greater, but this knowledge changed nothing because leadership chose to believe in willpower, technological wonder weapons, and historical destiny rather than arithmetic. The air war continued until Germany's complete military collapse, until cities were ruins, until millions more were dead, until the Third Reich was utterly destroyed. The lesson from this historical episode transcends World War II and remains relevant for understanding modern conflict. Accurate intelligence is worthless if leadership refuses to accept unwelcome conclusions. Systematic analysis means nothing if decisions are based on ideology rather than evidence. Professional competence becomes irrelevant when confronted with willful blindness. German intelligence provided accurate assessment of Allied air capabilities and probable outcomes. German leadership chose fantasy over reality, and the result was catastrophe that might have been limited through earlier acceptance of mathematical truth. Wars between industrial powers are fundamentally economic contests won in factories before outcomes are decided in the sky. This principle was proven definitively during World War II. Germany's intelligence analysts understood this by 1943. They documented it meticulously. They presented it clearly through reports that should have been impossible to ignore. They warned repeatedly that continued air operations would only increase the magnitude of ultimate defeat, without changing the outcome. Their leadership never accepted this truth. The cost of that refusal was measured in destroyed cities, thousands of dead aircrew, hundreds of thousands of civilians killed in bombing raids that could not be prevented, and Germany's total destruction as a nation-state capable of waging war. In the end, German analysts studied American aircraft production statistics and understood they could never achieve air superiority, not through any single revelation, but through accumulation of undeniable evidence over months and years. Each captured production manifest added data points. Each serial number analysis confirmed patterns. Each prisoner interrogation provided validation. Each intelligence report from neutral countries corroborated previous assessments. The picture that emerged was complete, verified, mathematically certain. Germany faced an enemy with 3 to 4 times its aircraft production capacity, and that gap was widening. No amount of tactical skill or fighting spirit could overcome such fundamental disparity in a war of industrial attrition. The intelligence analysts knew this, documented it with precision that should have been undeniable, and presented it clearly to leadership through proper channels and formal reports. Their tragedy was not analytical failure. Their work was professional, thorough, based on verified data from multiple independent sources. Their tragedy was the irrelevance of accurate intelligence when leadership refuses to accept reality because it contradicts ideological beliefs or political necessities. The captured American production documents told a story of inevitable defeat, written in numbers that could not be argued with except through willful blindness. They showed American aircraft abundance that seemed impossible according to German industrial experience, but was verified through multiple independent sources using different methodologies. They revealed an enemy with such overwhelming production capacity that German hopes of achieving air superiority were fantasies disconnected from material reality. The only question remaining by late 1943, when Colonel Schmid compiled his comprehensive analysis, was how long Germany would deny what the numbers made mathematically certain. How many more pilots would die before arithmetic replaced ideology as the basis for strategic decisions? How many more cities would burn before industrial capacity was recognized as the decisive factor in modern warfare? That question was answered on May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed not primarily through tactical defeats or strategic blunders, though both occurred, but by the mathematical certainty that industrial capacity determines victory in modern air warfare. The intelligence analysts who first studied those captured American production manifests in 1943 had understood this truth 18 months before final defeat. They had tried to warn their leadership through proper channels and professional reports based on verified data. They had presented the evidence with clarity that should have compelled action. They had shown the mathematics that made continued air operations strategically futile. Their warnings were ignored because accepting them meant accepting inevitable defeat, and Nazi ideology could not accommodate such acceptance. Millions paid the price for that willful blindness. The American production statistics documented not just industrial output, but the futility of fighting against overwhelming material superiority in modern industrialized warfare. The numbers told a truth that German leadership could not accept, regardless of how clearly it was presented or how thoroughly it was documented. In modern industrial warfare, factories matter more than courage. Production lines determine outcomes more surely than tactics. Training capacity shapes results more fundamentally than individual skill, and arithmetic, cold and implacable, always wins in the end. The 300,000 aircraft America produced during World War II represented more than military hardware. They represented industrial democracy's capacity to outproduce authoritarian regimes through superior economic systems, broader resource bases, and organizational methods that emphasized efficiency over ideology. The analysts who documented this understood they were witnessing not just German defeat, but proof that free societies with market economies could outproduce command economies when fully mobilized. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.